Hello, I just wanted to make sure that everyone can hear me now.
Yes, Camille, we can hear you.
Awesome, thank you.
Kristen and Eddie, can we do a quick sound check?
Yes, I've unmuted. Is it working for me?
That's perfect, Kristen. Thank you. Eddie?
Hello, it's me.
Hello, fancy seeing you here, sort of.
So I do seem not to be able to start my video.
I was just about to ask if I needed to give you host
I think you probably do, because I can't see myself either, which is not a terrible thing, but you may want to see me. Hold on. No, that seems to be working.
There
wonderful.
you go. Yay.
I think I like it better the other way.
Camille, I think I have to do the same for you.
Yes.
All right, there you are all co-hosts now, so we should be able to see you all. And you can all share screens should you so desire.
Excellent. That will be me. And yep, it looks like I can. Perfect.
And there we go.
I guess should I start sharing the PowerPoint now, or should I wait? Does it matter?
What do you think, Camille?
You can start now, and I'll introduce both you and Eddie, and then people will be able to see the beginning of your presentation.
Excellent.
Awesome. So it's 11:30, so I will start the introduction.
Thank you, Camille. Have fun.
Thank you. So hello and welcome to our next presentation, A Collection of Curiosities, the Lilly Toth Miniature Book Collection by Kristen and Eddie. Before we begin, we have a few brief housekeeping notes. So if you wish to ask a question or make a comment, you can do so in the chat. Questions and comments will be collected during the presentation and will be addressed by the speakers during the Q&A period. If you experience technical difficulties with Zoom, you can type your question in the chat. A technical support moderator in your session will be available to assist you. This presentation is being recorded and will be available for attendees following the conference. The Q&A period will not be recorded. Live captioning is available at the bottom of your screen. You can enable this by selecting the live captioning features. Please note these captions are not 100% accurate. It is possible that we will experience some technical issues during the presentation. Please be patient should a technical issue arise. If a problem, such as the speaker video audio freezing, should occur, we will wait a few minutes to see if the issue can be resolved, and we will communicate with the attendees any alternate plans. So I am now pleased to welcome Kristen Howard, who is a Master of Information Studies student at McGill University and aspiring academic librarian. She holds a PhD in history from the Division for Late Medieval and Reformation Studies at the University of Arizona. Kristen's research interests include user studies of humanities researchers focused on the use of digital surrogate and animating special collection through public history and creative project. The other presenter is Eddie Paul, who is Senior Director of Library and Learning Services at the Jewish Public Library in Montreal, where, amongst other things, he oversees collection development, cataloging, reference, and planning. He developed the Rare Books Workshop Initiative in 2014 to mark the JPL Centennial Year. In the spring of that year, co-curated the exhibit of the Rare Books, A Room Full of Dwellings. In 2016, he co-curated the exhibit Decanting Memory in a collaboration with the Jacob Lowy Collection of Library and Archive Canada. He has also developed a series of Jewish genealogy workshops for secondary school students, and in the beginning of 2022 will be overseeing an array of interactive education programs as part of the JPL's Digital Transformation Initiative. So Kristen and Eddie, you can start now. Thank you.
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. I am so excited to talk to you about this collection of books. So for the majority of this talk, I am going to be talking to you, and then Eddie is going to take over at the end to talk a little bit more about the future plans. So here I have a tantalizing first glimpse of one of the miniature books in the collection. And this is the overview of the talk today. So first I'll talk about what miniature books are, why they're collected and how they're created before turning to the Toth collection in particular. And I'll tell you a little bit more about the donor Lilly Toth, and I'll give you quite a few highlights from the collection because I can't help myself. I just love them so much before we talk about the future plans for the exhibition. So to begin, what is a miniature book other than just a book that is a bit small? So a miniature book as a genre or designation is entirely focused on size rather than on content. And the binding definition of what constitutes a miniature book has been decided on by the Miniature Book Society, which is the preeminent society of miniature book collectors, creators, and enthusiasts. According to the society, a miniature book is considered mini if it is bound and less than 3 inches in length and width. And there are further categories of size. A macro miniature is slightly larger, up to 4 inches. A micro miniature is less than 1 inch, and an ultra micro miniature is less than 1/4 of an inch. And all of these sizes are represented in the Toth collection. So historically, books have been produced in small and miniature sizes since the invention of writing, beginning with miniature cuneiform tablets in ancient Babylon. And the history of miniature books matches that of book history more generally, with the creation of miniaturized tablets, scrolls, manuscripts, and finally printed books.
Christine?
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt you. We can see like the presenter mode, so not the full screen for your presentation.
How about now?
That is awesome. Thank you.
Excellent. Less distracting now for everyone.
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much. So while conducting research on miniature books, I noticed that several of the largest collection of miniatures, many of which have been donated to academic libraries, were begun by women collectors like Lilly Toth. And that's something that I'm interested in exploring further in the future, as this is also true for ephemera in general. So this is the case for the largest collection of minis in the world, which is now held at the Lilly Library at the University of Indiana at Bloomington. What began as an 8,000 book personal collection of Ruth Adomit, a collector and scholar of mini books, is now a collection of over 16,000 miniatures. Notable collections here in Canada include the Royce Gale collection at McGill, which is especially rich in fine press books. And there are also smaller collections at the University of Toronto, University of British Columbia, and the Toronto Public Library. And these are all especially rich in children's books. So why collect miniatures? So although the content of miniatures is considered important by collectors, minis are seldom collected to actually be read. The minuscule text and frequently delicate or stiff bindings make it too challenging or uncomfortable to read most miniatures. So there's other reasons to collect them. And the allure of miniature books is dependent on several other aspects from this size. They are practical, they're portable, they're curious, and a number of them have a particular aesthetic value. So miniatures are practical because they take up a very small amount of space. And this can make them ideal for collectors living in small spaces, like many Montreal apartments, like where I am right now. And some collectors do say that they began collecting because of a size consideration. They could only fit one shelf in a room, for example. The small size is also practical for the also small size of children's hands. And many book collectors first began collecting when they were children themselves, developing a lifelong interest in miniatures. Miniatures are also very portable. They can easily be stowed in a pocket or a purse, which makes them excellent for travelers or traveling merchants or soldiers. A miniature that's a prized possession is easy to carry, which is especially important for religious books. And minis can also be used or referred to quite discreetly. Think of someone wanting to check on the translation of a word in a bilingual dictionary without needing to give away that they needed to check that. Or you can think of a young woman in the Victorian era discreetly referring to an etiquette book while courting to make sure that she was giving the right kind of signals. Miniatures are, by their very nature, curious, as something defined entirely by size, and many people find themselves drawn to items that are either much smaller or larger than is typical. And I think that there's something quite attractive about important texts being available in small packages. There's something wondrous and even magical about being able to hold in your hands the words of a famous author or playwright like Shakespeare, or for a religious person to carry the word of God in their hands. And finally, many miniature books have a particular aesthetic value, especially those that are referred to as artist books or fine press books, many of which are created entirely by hand and have unusual or exquisite shapes. And I'll be showing you at least one of those. And the miniature size presents a challenge to all of the artisans who may be involved in bookmaking, from typesetting to printing to illustrating to binding. And this challenge enhances the allure of miniatures for many collectors and creators. So today, miniatures are created both by hand as well as by machine. And the pictures I have for you here are some images that were shared with me by Alexander Cave, who's a hobbyist bookbinder in Scotland, who's been binding miniatures recently. And so these are some pictures that give you an idea of different aspects of binding. So before the onset of the printing press in Western Europe, which of course trailed behind the creation of movable type in the East by hundreds of years, miniatures were, like other manuscripts, created entirely by hand. But the first printed book in Western Europe in miniature size came from the workshop of Johannes Gutenberg, the creator of the movable press and the Gutenberg Bible in Germany, and that was printed by his assistant Peter Schoeffer in 1468. So that was the onset of printed miniatures in Western Europe. Miniatures became, since then, increasingly popular and therefore increasingly profitable, especially in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And technological advancements allowed printers to produce more miniatures. A major boon for the popularity of mini books occurred in England in 1922, when Queen Mary solicited the creation of a miniature library at scale for her dollhouse. The books were created at the scale of 1 to 12, so 1 inch to 1 foot, and the books were about the size of a postage stamp, and all of them included the exact text of the books in regular size. Many of Queen Mary's subjects, as well as collectors across the pond here in North America, were inspired from this to collect miniature books for their own dollhouses, which were quite popular at the time. And this led to a bit of a mini book craze in the first quarter of the 20th century that kind of continued on for many people. Some specific technological advancements included typecasting machines, which allowed type to be cut by machine rather than hand, which led to the creation of smaller fonts. And most miniature books are printed at size 6 font, although especially tiny books are sometimes printed in a size 2 or 2.5. And this slide gives you an idea of what that means. So of course this is different because we're all looking at this on different screens, but we're all quite familiar by now with what a size 12 font looks like printed. So here we can see size 12 compared to size 6 and size 2 fonts. So that comparison, I think, demonstrates exactly how tiny the font is in some miniature books. A further technological development that aided the creation of miniature books included photographic reduction, which combined with lithographical printing allowed for the reduction of so-called mother books into miniaturized versions. And I'll have one example of that to share with you later as well. Okay, so now that we've kind of gone through what miniature books are, why they're collected, and how they're created, we can move on to the Lilly Toth miniature book collection. So the collection is over 1,000 miniature books, and as you'll see, it's eclectic, diverse, and multilingual. It includes books from nearly all popular miniature book genres, and I'm going to go through a few of them here, and it's a little bit of a long list. So this includes fine literature, religious texts, poetry, children's books, dictionaries, atlases, travel books, astrology, cookery, humor, sports, musical scores, history, facsimiles, erotica, and more. Everything is represented in the Toth collection. So before we dive into the collection, I'd like to tell you a bit more about Lilly Toth, because as we're speaking about windows and mirrors, I think that the Toth collection gives us this particular window into Lilly Toth's life that I think really enhances the value of this collection. So Lilly Toth was born in Budapest in 1925, and she described her childhood as happy and herself as a misbehaving, spoiled brat. As a Jewish family, Lilly and her parents suffered from Hungary's movement to the political right in the 1920s and 30s that led to increased nationalism and anti-Semitism following practices that were being established in Germany. In 1940, Hungary joined the Axis powers, allying itself with Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. In March 1944, German forces occupied Hungary, and Lilly's father, Victor, was drafted into a forced labor battalion. Both of Lilly's parents, Victor and Carla Gluck, were taken away in October 1944 after the fascist Arrow Cross organization took control of the Hungarian government. At this stage, Lilly went into hiding, but she was soon found by the Arrow Cross. After miraculously surviving an attempted execution at the shores of the Danube, she recuperated at a Jewish hospital, and she worked as a cleaner at an Arrow Cross building for the remainder of the war. After surviving the Holocaust, Lilly remained in Hungary until the outbreak of the Hungarian Revolution in 1956, and that's when she decided to emigrate to Canada. She settled here in Montreal, where she already had family members. And while living in Montreal, she regularly volunteered at the Montreal Holocaust Museum, and she contributed her life story to the museum's oral history collection. Her oral history is incredibly moving, and there is a short clip of her testimony on YouTube for those who might be interested in hearing more about Lilly's life. So while she was living here in Montreal, she began her collection of miniature books. And her collection is especially rich in Hungarian miniatures, and I have a selection here of some of those for you. And this might seem obvious or perhaps unimportant because Lilly herself was a native Hungarian speaker, but there is something really important about this large number and high value of Hungarian books. And that's because collectors considered Hungary to be the producer of the highest quality miniature books in the world from around 1948 into the 1970s and 80s, the time when Lilly was really developing her collection of books. The desirability of Hungarian minis has a few different things that contributed to it. So first, they were produced in very limited numbers, and so they were quite rare, which is of course something that collectors are interested in. And on many of the colophons of these books, including some of the ones here, they'll say this is number 1 of a printing of 500, or a printing of 1,000, or a printing of 200 in red ink and black ink. There's a lot of different information that tells you just how rare these books are. Because few of them were printed, they were circulated only locally in miniature book collecting circles or clubs or at specific shops. And so again, this increased their rarity and made them more interesting to collectors who were located outside of Hungary. Hungarian miniatures are also frequently multilingual, published not only in Hungarian, but also in Russian, German, English, and Hebrew, meaning that a wider audience could appreciate the subject matter. And finally, some have pointed to the fact that Hungary was communist from 1949 to 1989, and that this fact enhanced the quality of Hungarian miniature books because the communist government tightly controlled the production of literature, leading to very high quality printing, design, and bindings. And this kind of quality control wasn't happening in other countries, especially in Europe. And finally, there was a shortage of domestic goods that could be collected by Hungarians during this time. So those who had a passion for collecting had very few outlets to kind of meet that desire. And in my opinion, the Toth collection is the finest collection of Hungarian miniature books in North America. And I think that this is really valuable for several reasons. Okay, now I'm going to highlight several of the individual books from the collection that I think really speak to the educational and aesthetic value of the Toth collection before finally turning it over to Eddie to speak on future plans for the collection. So I'll begin with what is likely the oldest book in the collection, Small Rain Upon the Tender Herb. This book was first printed around 1830, and it's been popular among many book collectors from the Victorian era to today. It contains a short Bible extract for each day of the year, and the title stems from the book of Deuteronomy, and the verse says, "My doctrine shall drop as the rain, my speech shall dew as the dew, as the small rain upon the tender herb, and as the showers upon the grass." So this edition here in the Toth collection is the 39th impression of this book, which may have been the last printed edition and was likely printed around 1860. But it's nearly impossible to date this one specifically, but it is older by probably 10 or 20 years than the other oldest books in the collection. This copy seems to have been given as a gift, according to the dated inscription on the flyleaf, which reads, Catherine Bradwell with love, J.E. Mez, January 31st, 1926. And I love when these older books have these kinds of inscriptions. And as you can see in the picture here, Lilly kept her copy safe in this small coin purse, which protected it from dust and from anything else, and I think really shows how much she treasured this individual book. Okay, from the oldest book in the collection to the smallest. This is the Lord's Prayer, and it is an ultra micro miniature at less than 5 millimeters in length and width that was first printed in 1952 and then reprinted in the 1960s. And it's impossible to determine which printing ours is from, but it's likely from the 1960s because more were printed during that time, but we can't be sure. It's stored in a transparent plexiglass case that doubles as a very strong magnifying glass, as you can see in the second picture here on the right. And without that magnifying glass, I would not have been able to identify this book. When I first found this book on the shelf, I brought it over to Eddie's office and I said, look at this, I have no idea what it is. And we were able to figure it out after we finally realized that the case was a magnifying glass. So this book includes the Lord's Prayer printed in 6 languages and was sold along with several others under the slogan, the smallest book in the world, in order to raise money for the rebuilding of the Gutenberg Museum after World War II. And this book and others like it were not printed by photographic reduction, but by actual miniaturized metal type. And I've seen a picture of this type, and it's cut into little tiny sheets rather than individual letters because it would be impossible to be able to place those kinds of letters either by hand or even by machine, I think. So the next book is one that was printed by photographic reduction. And I have an interesting font issues there because of the Hungarian. And I really love the story behind this book. So in 1973, the Petőfi Literary Museum in Budapest held a children's drawing competition, asking children to submit drawings illustrating the poems of Sándor Petőfi, a 19th century poet in Hungary who's considered Hungary's national poet and the museum's namesake. From these drawings that were submitted by children, the museum curated an exhibition. And then in 1975, they published an exhibit catalog in a kind of normal exhibit size, 20 by 27 centimeters. And then the following year, they used photographic reduction to print this miniaturized version of the catalog. And part of why I like this so much is if you've handled an exhibit catalog, they're very large usually. They're quite huge, often very heavy. It would be impossible for a child, one of the children who had submitted a drawing, to be able to handle it. So by making it into a miniature, it's sized for the hands of the artists themselves. And I think that that's quite nice. And so this miniature size is 5 by 7 centimeters, which is a pretty typical miniature book size, although very few in the Toth collection or in general are printed in this landscape orientation. So that's a little bit unusual. So I want to give you another example of children's books. And that are these books, which you may be familiar with. Children's books are quite well represented in the Toth collection, including all 23 tales written by Beatrix Potter, one of the best known English children's book authors of the early 20th century. The Tale of Peter Rabbit, which is one of the most printed books in English in history, first appeared in 1902, and the Toth collection includes boxed sets of all of the Potter books in this 1986 printing by Viking Children's Books. And I think that these are partially interesting because since they're in these box sets, this is kind of emblematic of a resurgence of a trend that originated around the turn of the 19th century, when booksellers first began to produce complete miniature libraries for children that were bound in bookcases or boxes. So we're seeing that happening again at the end of the 20th century in these books that I think many of us today are quite familiar with. And whereas these books were intended for the use of children, This next book, which I've also categorized as a children's book, seems, in my opinion, not to have been intended for children, but actually for the use of adults. So this is the ABC of Insects by A.R. Mason, and in it, each letter of the alphabet corresponds to an insect with a black and white illustration on the facing page. A is for ant, B is for bumblebee, C is for caterpillar, J is for June bug, as you can see here, and so on. Now, alphabet books are one of the most common genres in miniature books intended for children, but this book is really too small, even for children. It's too small to open. It's quite difficult. It was very hard to take these pictures. It has a very tight leather binding and is only 25 millimeters. So I would argue that this kind of miniature book, although it addresses a children's theme, is primarily intended for adults collecting miniature books and not for the use of children. And this is, in Lilly's collection, is in a glass case along with some of the other smallest books in the collection. And so I think that because it was on a glass case, as opposed to some of her more open shelves, that's like another indication that it really wasn't intended to be opened or read, but rather to be admired from the beautiful exterior. So from children's literature to fine literature. The first set of Shakespeare's plays to be published in miniature appeared in 1880, and Shakespeare quickly became the most popular author in miniature books. And the Toth collection includes several different printings of Shakespeare, but this is my favorite set, the Knickerbocker Leather and Novelty Company set of Shakespeare's that were printed between 1890 and 1930. So the Toth collection includes nearly 2 full sets of Knickerbocker Shakespeare's, and they're notable for their beautiful marbled end paper, which I have pictured here in the brown, but they're also in green and in red. And then the different shades of limp leather binding, brown, yellow, red, and black. And because we have all of these different colors presented, I think that this indicates that Lilly likely acquired the books individually rather than as a single set, because all of the sets that I've seen are a single color. So I think that Lilly was acquiring these one at a time because she liked this particular printing. And this may also be kind of enhanced by the fact that she owns 1 copy of King Lear, but 3 copies of Twelfth Night. So she either really loved Twelfth Night or she was buying them as she could find them. And this may indicate that all the books in different colors are from different printing years. And so they may span that entire 40-year period that the Knickerbocker Company was printing. Now, fine literature and classics like Shakespeare and novels were frequently published in miniature in the early 20th century, and this allowed a wider audience of people to read and own important works of literature who may not otherwise have been able to access it. And for those of us who have studied kind of the history of libraries in the 19th and 20th centuries, I think we can see this kind of parallel between libraries emerging, public libraries in particular, and this kind of printing that makes fine literature more accessible to more people. Okay, next I'd like to share what we think of as one of the real highlights of the Toth collection, and that is this Lilliput English-Yiddish dictionary. This was printed in Germany between 1910 and 29 and distributed in the Bronx, and it includes 1,200 words, sample dialogues, and thematic vocabulary lists at the back that are all related to food and dining. It's notably bound in this brown snap leather case, which protects the edges, which, as you can see in the picture on the right, has that really nice red publisher stain. So the word choice in this dictionary appears to be aimed at helping individuals in daily speech and conducting conversation, and perhaps specifically in sharing meals because of that food emphasis that I noted. There are also versions of this miniature dictionary published without the leather snap case, and also as Yiddish to English rather than English to Yiddish. And there are also Lilliput dictionaries for other languages as well, although this is the only one in the Toth collection. She has quite a few other bilingual dictionaries and a few monolingual dictionaries, but this is the only one that's in one of those glass cases that I think includes some of her most prized books. Okay, now I'd like to share a curiosity from the collection, which is an example of an artist's book. This was printed by Tony and Sandy Grace at their Twin Heart Press in San Diego, and Sandy wrote, designed, and bound the book, and Tony operated the letterpress. And as you can see here, this book is a work of functional art. Shaped as a cameo brooch, it also has a pin on the back, allowing it to be worn as a brooch. And one of the unusual things about this book is that the printing inside is primarily in lavender ink, which is very unusual for books in general, but for miniature books for sure. And this book is quite rare, as you can see in one of the pictures I've included here. Only 26 copies were created, and they were numbered instead of lettered, and the Toth collection copy is lettered T. And I like to think that perhaps Lilly chose this specifically to match her last name, although I don't have proof of that, but I do find it a nice coincidence. Okay, so now I'm going to show you two final items. I'm finally going to be wrapping up. That go beyond the traditional definition of miniature book, but I think provide us one of those windows into Lilly's life story and demonstrate that for her, collecting miniature books was sometimes about beauty or rarity, but other times was about collecting touch, history, and culture, rather than being the kind of collector who was seeking the most beautiful or the most valuable miniatures. So the first is the Abridged Prayer Book for Jews in the Armed Forces of the United States, which was published by the National Jewish Welfare Board. So the goal of the National Jewish Welfare Board, which was created in the United States in 1917, just days after the US officially joined the Great War, World War I, was to provide religious support to Jewish soldiers during the conflict. The Jewish Publication Society of America offered to publish an abridged prayer book for the use of soldiers when they couldn't attend services, because they were at war, of course. And that led to the first version of this book. It includes Hebrew text, an English translation of Singer's prayer book, and festival services adopted from a similar prayer book prepared by the British Armed Forces. This copy, published in 1945 during World War II, appears to have been given as a gift due to some of the handwriting that we can find in the book. Now, this is well over the sizes for even a macro miniature at 13 centimeters or 5 inches in length. And you can see in the pictures with my hands how much larger it is than some of the other books. It's one of several Jewish religious books that are included in the Toth collection, even though they are beyond the size of miniature books. And I think that this demonstrates that for Lilly, some books, especially those that serve as cultural touchstones to important, if traumatic, moments in her life, were worth collecting. And that brings us to the next and final book, which highlights this point. And I'm going to talk about a little bit of a difficult experience in this. So if you might find hearing about a person's more traumatic Holocaust experience to be difficult, you might want to mute me until I go on to the next slide. So this is the Bori Notes, or Bor Notebook, which connects even more intimately with Lilly's story as a survivor of the Holocaust in Hungary. So this book is actually two books, as you can see in this picture. It's a facsimile, which is pictured on the right, as well as a transcription, a printed transcription of a notebook kept by Hungarian poet Miklós Radnóti during the Holocaust before he was murdered. Critically, it includes his final 10 poems, which would have been lost to history without the notebook's very tragic, if actually incredible, story. So Radnóti penned his final poem after a forced march from Bor in Serbia to Hungary, where he was murdered in a mass execution in 1944. The notebook was in his pocket when he was murdered, and so it was buried alongside him in a mass grave. But it was discovered 10 months later when the grave was exhumed and all of the bodies were identified. And this allowed Radnóti's final poems to be shared with the Hungarian Jewish community and eventually published. And there are English translations of these poems available online if you're interested. So I think that this notebook and this printing represents Radnóti's strength of spirit during his forced labor, and the facsimile of the notebook is an incredible object for research or teaching about the experience of the Holocaust for Hungarian Jews. Again, this book is well over the size of a miniature at 19 centimeters or 7.5 inches, but it was published by a well-known miniature book press in Hungary, Helicon Kyoto, who printed the majority of Lilly's Hungarian miniatures. I think it's notable both that the notebook was reproduced in its original size rather than being scaled down to a miniature, and that it was created by a miniature book press. So taken as a whole, after I bring 10 items out to show you, the Toth collection sheds light on Lilly's experience. It gives us a window and a mirror into her experience of the Holocaust, the history of Hungary, and her life afterwards as well. It shows us her interests from history to literature and her appreciation of more whimsical aspects of miniature books like children's books and curiosities. So I think the Toth collection really has something to inspire and educate and delight everyone. And it can be used in teaching and research and outreach in a large variety of ways. And this includes the current online exhibits, and I'm just giving you a little screenshot here of the front page of the exhibit, which is available on the JPL Special Collections website. And in this, we have the books, including all the ones that I've talked about today, as well as dozens of others, organized into 6 themes. You can recognize a number of the pictures here from ones that I've showed you. And hopefully this will be further expanded in the future. So this weekend, we're going to officially launch the collection in person. And now I will hand it over to Eddie to talk about other future plans for the collection.
Thank you, Kristen. Camille, may I just ask you how much time I have?
Sorry, I was muted. You still have 25 minutes in all, including the questions and yeah.
Excellent. I can take my time then. Thank you very much. Thanks, Kristen. I should just a correction. Since Kristen sent you her bio, Camille, Kristen is actually now a faculty liaison library at McGill University, which sort of harkens back to the time I interviewed her back in December. She was introduced as Dr. Kristen Howard, and my first words to her was, I feel like she should be interviewing me, not the other way around. And I think her presentation over the last half hour kind of bears that out. But thank you. That was actually, I learned so much. I have learned so much from Kristen. This is really quite astounding. Thank you. I'm not sharing my screen, so you'll just have to have my face and my voice inflicted on you for the next 15, 20 minutes. I noted that the theme for the ABQLA conference was Through the Looking Glass, and I'm going to riff on that for the next 15 minutes, if you'll just oblige me. As you probably know, in Alice Through the Looking Glass, Alice walks through a mirror and finds that everything is reversed, even logic, especially logic. And what appealed to my sense of romance about this is that the very thing that reflects is also the thing that distorts. And it's this idea I'd like to look at in the next 10 minutes or so in the context of this collection, which will also give you a ground for what our plans are. Kristen, may I just ask you very briefly, what was your first impression of the collection when you saw the collection for the first time?
I'm not sure if I've ever told you this, Eddie, but I think I had the opposite first impression of you, which is when I first saw the collection, I thought, is this it? Because I couldn't believe that 1,000 miniature books were on the shelves that have now been moved into the library. And it wasn't until I started processing and assessing them that I realized the impact of how many and how varied and what a window into Lily's life they were. So my first reaction was like, what else?
This was purely a leading question and highly manipulative on my part. So I'm very glad you answered that way. And we've talked about this before. I'm glad. Thank you for the answer, because that was what I was hoping you would say. People are alternately besotted or dulled in the presence of multitudes of things rather than when they're in singles or in pairs. 1 or 2 miniature books, not such a big deal. 1,119 lining 4 walls of a bedroom, on the other hand, a bigger deal. I recall many years ago, during a tour of our Montreal Holocaust Museum, how the curators tried to convey the poignancy and gravitas of a single shoe rather than a warehouse of shoes. So obviously, context is important. When I first saw this collection a few years ago, I was invited into Lily's apartment with my colleague, Nicole Baudry. Some of you may know her, remember her. She now works in Vancouver. And she and I, along with my other colleague, Eddie Stone, continue to offer rare book workshops, which some of you might be familiar with. And I can talk about a little bit more about those a little bit later. Nicole's reaction at seeing this collection was emotional. Now, Nicole was a very, very emotional person, but her reaction to this was, this is absolutely mind-blowing. I tend to be a bit more taciturn. For those of you who have seen all of the media exposure we've had, I use the word mind-blowing a lot, but that's mainly media hype. I was a bit more taciturn when I saw it. My first response to seeing this collection was, how could I create a narrative around this collection? At the time, I was thinking of a very influential essay I had read many years ago by the great literary critic George Steiner, who had an essay called Our Homeland, the Text. And this particular essay was about how Jewish texts are portable homelands for Jews. And so we looked at the collection a little bit more closely, and as we were doing this, I was already contriving a story about how Lilly smuggled these books out of Hungary, exemplifying the attachment Jews and books have had for one another over the centuries. Completely bogus, utterly false. Lilly started collecting these post-1956 when she escaped Hungary, when she left Hungary. And the reality is she just thought they were beautiful. She thought they were worth collecting. She was a collector of other things. When we were packing up the collection to bring to the library, you know, she had a collection of tchotchkes. She was a collector of things. She had no children. And that was, of course, the other part of the story that I've been spinning a little bit, that these books really represented her Erzet's children. So my agenda there was, you know, how with a little bit of work, how could this be turned into a great institutional saga? Tugging a little too hard on the truth, but that's never really stopped me before. It's at this point that I want to ask you all a rhetorical question. Asking questions is really an intrinsic spiritual practice that has yielded the entire Jewish canon. What exactly is the difference between this, and I don't know if you can see this, on my screen it shows backwards, but then I guess we're talking through the looking glass, and maybe that's appropriate. So what's the difference between this, a mass market paperback? Some might have other euphemisms for this. I'm not judging. This is Nora Roberts' Blue Dahlia, one of the books that I collect for our public who renew their memberships on the basis of these books. Again, I'm not judging. So what's the difference between this and this? This is our 1707 printing of a book called the Ma'aset Tovia. I'm going to try holding it up if you can see it. This is a very famous photograph of a man depicted as a house. This is the first medical science textbook printed in Hebrew by a man named Tobias Katz. And this is one of the books that we take with us on our rare book workshops. And what is the difference between that and this? This is one of the books, you can barely see this. Let me hold it right up to my webcam. This is the ultra macro miniature. This is the Lord's Prayer translated into 6 languages. This is the Yiddish Bible. What is the difference between all of them? The macro miniature Lord's Prayer translated into 6 languages. Its text originates from the Hebrew prayer Shemona Esrei, referenced in several Talmudic tractates. It's got a whole story behind it. And by rhetorical question, the obvious answers, their relative sizes, their content. In the case of the Nora Roberts, its derivative plot, its predictable characters, its disposable narrative. Again, I'm not judging those of you who are Nora Roberts fans. Those are not really the stories I'm interested in. Kristen pointed out to me during the time that she was here that the mass market minis, and they're very well represented in the Lilly Toth collection, are and these are ones you can probably still order online, and you can probably still find them in places like Multimags. These are just as interesting and just as worthwhile as the Lord's Prayer. And in 100 years' time, they may be regarded as just as rare and just as curious. Now, it would take a lot more work to develop a backstory to a Nora Roberts romance than the Lord's Prayer, but we know from Kristen's research that people like Gutenberg would hire apprentices, and to test their mettle and their dexterity, would task them with creating books like this. This is the Ultra Macro Miniature. And if they were able to actually create this miniature type for these books, they would raise through the ranks and achieve immortality. Before Gutenberg even compiled the printing press in the mid-15th century, and this is a story that perhaps some of you know, he decided that he was going to make a killing selling these compact mirrors to pilgrims on their pilgrimage to Aachen, where the Emperor Charlemagne was buried with several holy relics. And it was believed that these compact mirrors would enable the pilgrims to capture the holy rays that emanated from these sacred relics. Gutenberg thought he was going to make a killing. He was really a sort of an innovative businessman at the time. He was more of a businessman and an entrepreneur than he was an inventor. What happened? Well, in 1439, the Black Death, which sadly dumped Gutenberg's investment into the black, ironically. And 11 years later, what happened? All because of a looking glass and a pandemic, we ended up with the printing press. Now, what is it that outlasts a pandemic? For one thing, the story. This is the basis of the JPL's Rare Book Workshop initiative, and these mini books will, over the next few years, become very much a part of this initiative once we tease out their stories, and this is something that Kristen has already done. It's in the telling of the story that we honor their existence and their collector, Lilly Toth, but it also honors the ways in which the book confers meaning in our lives. The Rare Books Initiative started in 2014, which was our centennial year, yes. And the idea was we wanted these books up until that point had been sort of lying in these acid-free boxes in our basement, in our archives. And we wanted to make them more enduring. And one of the ways you make something more enduring is you share them with people and you share them through the story. And this is what we have been doing for the last 7 years to synagogues, churches, universities. We've given these workshops to classes in the School of Information Studies at McGill, Concordia and McGill. We've done collaborations with Fisher Rare Books at U of T, McGill University's Rare Books, the National Library of Israel, Carleton, and we're just beginning. These minis will form part of the Rare Book Workshop initiative as we go forward over the next few years. And by virtue of their material history, by virtue of their formats, I expect that these will form an intrinsic part of the telling of this story. Thank you.
Excellent. I think we have a little bit of time left. If anybody has questions, I have just the final slide with the final book and our emails. If you have any questions, I'll leave this up for a minute, but if anybody has any questions, I think we would be very happy to answer them.
I don't see any questions for now, but I do have a question from myself. So you said that mostly women were collectors of mini books and that you were interested in that. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, I've stopped sharing. I think I did that correctly. So I found that the largest collection and some of the most collections of miniature books were begun by women collectors, or alternately were begun by married couples, but the woman in the couple was left off of some records, which I found a bit galling, especially after learning that, for example, women authors are underrepresented on Wikipedia. This is something that I've become quite interested in. But anyways, I've also done some studies of collections of ephemera, and it seems that women are overrepresented as collectors of ephemera. So I mean things like menus, letters, loose papers, things that are unimportant. And so I have this hypothesis that will require much more research, that perhaps miniature books compared to regular books or important rare books, miniature books weren't considered as important. But we see in publications about miniature books, most of which are not scholarly, that men collectors are overrepresented. But then there are these huge collections of thousands you know, 5,000, 8,000, 16,000 books at academic libraries in particular that were begun by women. And so I'm really interested if there are, you know, other reasons about that, if this is actually true about, you know, many collections across North America, if my kind of inkling is right, that miniature books were considered unimportant or cute, perhaps, and so were, you know, more desirable to women collectors than to men collectors. I'm really interested if that might be true, or if perhaps women and men, especially in the 20th century, tended to collect different kinds of miniature books. You know, perhaps men collected the ones that were the most valuable, and women collected mass market minis, like Eddie alluded to, or artist books that are more pretty than they are functional, or something like that. But this is something that I found very tantalizing when I started researching miniature books. But I knew that if I went down that rabbit hole, I wouldn't be able to help animate the Lilly Toth collection in particular. So I kind of put it on the shelf to consider later.
Can I just add to something Kristen was saying? One of the primary interests of my colleague Nicole is the sort of invisible presence of women in the history of Jewish printing. We have a number of those represented in our rare book collection. What we found was that women were employed quite robustly in the printing industry in the sort of, I guess, in the early modern period, because for a very strange reason, there was actually something that was a phenomenon known as the women's font. And this was a Yiddish font that was primarily sort of shaped in very curly kind of rounded letters because they were considered to be more feminine. Women also had smaller hands. They were actually able to use the wooden, I guess, the wooden engravings, and they were actually able to fit them into the metal trays much more easily than a lot of men were. So women were actually used quite often in Jewish printing. And in addition to that, men were often, you know, well, I'm not going to go too much into it, but suffice to say, it is something that is undiscovered. It is something yet to be discovered in the history of book printing, that the women have actually played a very large and important role in the history.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, it's super interesting. I'm also really interested in women in history and everything like that. So yeah, thank you both for your answers. I don't know if you saw in the chat, but we have a question. Have you done a statistical analysis of the collection by such things as language and subject?
Yeah, that's a really great question. We have not done that yet. I had a limited amount of time in which I got to work with the books. I spent, I think, 2 weeks cataloging the books and was able to catalog exactly 76. And since there are over 1,000, it will take much more time for us to do that. But I can say that I believe that the majority of the books are English, especially the mass market minis. And then after that, I would say that Hungarian is the best represented language. But the Hungarian books, because so many of them are multilingual, represent an interesting challenge for doing a statistical analysis, for example, because many of the Hungarians are at least trilingual, Hungarian, German, and Russian, and sometimes also additionally English. So that is definitely something that would be interesting to do after we have data about all of the books. But that will take some time because there are a lot of them and they're hard to read.
Yes, I can only imagine how hard that must be. Thank you. I see there is a question. Oh no, it says amazing. So in the Q&A there was just amazing. I don't see any other questions. So yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. It was super interesting and I've learned so much about all of that. Thank you again. So the next presentation here will actually be the trivia luncheon. So it will start at 12:30, so you can stay here or go to like have a actual lunch break if you prefer. But I think, well, I know that the trivia will be amazing because I prepared it myself with Veronica. So come and have fun with us. And it will start in 8 minutes. So thank you again, Eddie and Kristen. It was really amazing.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all so much. Let me know if you have questions about mini books. I love talking about them.